The Mosaic Covenant or Law of Moses, which Christians generally call the Old Covenant, has played an important role in the shaping of Christianity and has occasioned serious dispute and controversy since the beginnings of Christianity. Note for example Jesus' critique of the law during his Sermon on the Mount, the circumcision controversy in early Christianity, and the incident at Antioch, which has led scholars to dispute the relationship between Paul of Tarsus and Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism asserts that Moses presented the Jewish religious laws to the Jewish people and that those laws do not apply to Gentiles, with the exception of the 7 laws of Noah, which apply to all people. Many Christians believe that only parts are applicable, others believe that none apply. Dual covenant theologians believe that the Old Covenant remains valid only for Jews, and a minority have the view that all parts still apply to believers in Jesus and in the New Covenant. Distinct views. Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas explained that there are 3 types of biblical precepts: moral, ceremonial, and judicial. He holds that moral precepts are permanent, having held even before the law was given, since they are part of the law of nature. Ceremonial precepts and judicial precepts came into existence only with the law of Moses and were only temporary. The ceremonial commands were ordained to the divine worship for that particular time and to the foreshadowing of Christ. Accordingly, upon the coming of Christ they ceased to bind, and to observe them now would, Aquinas thought, be equivalent to declaring falsely that Christ has not yet come, for Christians a mortal sin. However, while the judicial laws ceased to bind with the advent of Christ, it was not a mortal sin to enforce them. Aquinas says, if a sovereign were to order these judicial precepts to be observed in his kingdom, he would not sin. Although Aquinas believed the specifics of the Old Testament judicial laws were no longer binding, he taught that the judicial precepts contained universal principles of justice that reflected natural law. Thus some scholars referred to his views on government as general equity theonomy. Unlike the ceremonial and judicial precepts, moral commands continue to bind, and are summed up in the 10 Commandments. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states, 2068, the Council of Trent teaches that the 10 Commandments are obligatory for Christians and that the justified man is still bound to keep them. The Second Vatican Council confirms, the bishops, successors of the apostles, receive from the Lord the mission of teaching all peoples, and of preaching the gospel to every creature, so that all men may attain salvation through faith, baptism and the observance of the commandments. 2070. The 10 Commandments belong to God's revelation. At the same time they teach us the true humanity of man. They bring to light the essential duties, and therefore, indirectly, the fundamental rights inherent in the nature of the human person. The Decalogue contains a privileged expression of the natural law. From the beginning, God had implanted in the heart of man the precepts of the natural law. Then he was content to remind him of them. This was the Decalogue. 2072. Since they express man's fundamental duties towards God and towards his neighbor, the 10 Commandments reveal, in their primordial content, grave obligations. They are fundamentally immutable, and they oblige always and everywhere. No one can dispense from them. The 10 Commandments are engraved by God in the human heart. The Roman Catholic Church teaches that the Apostles instituted the religious celebration of Sunday without transferring to it the ceremonial obligations associated with the Jewish Sabbath, although later some of these obligations became attached to Sunday, not without opposition within the Church. The Roman Catholic Church thus applies to Sunday, the Lord's Day, the third commandment. Lutheran Article 5 of the Formula of Concord of the Lutheran Church declares, the distinction between law and gospel is that law demands obedience to God's will, while gospel refers to the promise of forgiveness of sins in the light of the person and work of Jesus Christ. Between 1580 and 1713 this principle was considered of fundamental importance by Lutheran theologians. The foundation of evangelical Lutheran biblical exegesis and exposition is contained in the Apology of the Augsburg Confession. All scripture ought to be distributed into these two principal topics, the law and the promises. For in some places it presents the law, and in others, the promise concerning Christ, namely, either when, in the Old Testament, it promises that Christ will come, and offers, for his sake, the remission of sins, justification, and life eternal. Lutherans, quoting Colossians chapter 12 and Romans chapter 14, believe that circumcision and the other Old Testament ceremonial laws no longer apply to Christians. Calvinist. The view of the Reformed churches, or Calvinism, referred to as covenant theology, is similar to the Roman Catholic view in holding that Mosaic law continues under the New Covenant, while declaring that parts of it have expired, and are no longer applicable. The Westminster Confession of Faith divides the Mosaic laws into three categories: moral, civil, and ceremonial. In the view of the Westminster divines, only the moral laws of the Mosaic Law, which include the Ten Commandments and the commands repeated in the New Testament, directly apply to Christians today. Ceremonial laws, in this view, include the regulations pertaining to ceremonial cleanliness, festivals, diet, and the Levitical priesthood. Advocates of this view hold that, while not always easy to do, an overlap between categories does occur. The divisions they make are possible and supported based on information contained in the commands themselves, specifically to whom they are addressed, whom or what they speak about, and their content. For example, a ceremonial law might be addressed to the Levites, speak of purification or holiness, and have content that could be considered as a foreshadowing of some aspect of Christ's life or ministry. In keeping with this, most advocates also hold that when the law is spoken of as everlasting, it is in reference to certain divisions of the law. Anglican theology is defined to the degree it is expressed by its historic defining statements known as the 39 Articles. Article 7 of the Church of England's 1563 version, and other versions, specify only that Christians are bound by the commandments which are called moral, but not bound by the ceremonial, ritual, or civil laws from the Law of Moses. Dispensationalism as a theological system. Dispensationalism is rooted in the writings of John Nelson Darby and the Brethren movement, but it has never been formally defined and incorporates several variants. Dispensationalists divide the Bible into varying numbers of separate dispensations or ages. Traditional dispensationalists believe only the New Testament applies to the Church of today, whereas hyper-dispensationalists believe only the second half of the New Testament, starting either in the middle of Acts or at Acts chapter 28, applies. Wayne G. Strickland, professor of theology at the Multnomah University, claims that his dispensationalist view is that the age of the Church has rendered the law inoperative. This view holds that Mosaic laws and the penalties attached to them were limited to the particular historical and theological setting of the Old Testament. In that view, the law was given to Israel and does not apply since the age of the New Covenant. Replacing the Mosaic law is the law of Christ, which however holds definite similarities with the Mosaic law in moral concerns, but is new and different, replacing the original law. Despite this difference, dispensationalists continue to seek to find moral and religious principles applicable for today in Mosaic law. Understanding the New Covenant to be a new dispensation, George R. Law has proposed that the law of Christ is recorded in Matthew chapters 5 to 7. He suggests that Matthew's record of the Sermon on the Mount is structured similar to the literary form of an ancient Near Eastern covenant treaty. Law's theory is built on the groundbreaking work of Victor Korosek, Donald J. Wiseman, and George E. Mendenhall. This new covenant form, like other variations of the covenant form throughout ancient history, can be identified by its unique combination of ancient covenant elements. If this record in Matthew can be identified as the record of the promised New Covenant, then its contents can also be identified as the formal presentation of the law of Christ. One view of dispensationalism divides the Bible into these 7 periods: of innocence, prior to Adam's fall; of conscience, Adam to Noah; of government, Noah to Abraham; of patriarchal rule, Abraham to Moses; of the Mosaic law, Moses to Jesus; of grace, the current church age; and of a literal, earthly 1,000-year millennial kingdom that has yet to come. A natural misunderstanding of dispensationalism sees the covenant of Sinai to have been replaced by the gospel. However, dispensationalists believe that ethnic Israel, distinct from the church, and on the basis of the Sinai covenant, are featured in New Testament promises, which they interpret as referring to a future time associated with the millennium of Revelation chapter 20. In dispensational thought, although the time from Jesus' resurrection until his return is dominated by the proclamation of the gospel, the Sinai covenant is neither terminated nor replaced. Rather, it is quiescent, awaiting a fulfillment at the millennium. This time of Jewish restoration has an especially prominent place within dispensationalism. See also Christian Zionism. Theonomy starting in the 1970s and 1980s. An obscure branch of Calvinism known as Christian Reconstructionism argued that the civil laws as well as the moral laws should be applied in today's society as part of establishing a modern theonomic state. This view is a break from the traditional Reformed position, including that of John Calvin and the Puritans, which holds that the civil laws have been abrogated though they remain useful as guidance and revelation of God's character. Some theonomists go further and embrace the idea that the whole law continues to function, contending that the way in which Christians observe some commands has changed but not the content or meaning of the commands. For example, they would say that the ceremonial commands regarding Passover were looking forward to Christ's sacrificial death and the communion mandate is looking back on it. The former is given to the Levitical priesthood and the latter is given to the priesthood of all believers, but both have the same content and meaning. New Covenant theology. New Covenant theology is a recently expressed Christian theological system on this issue that incorporates aspects of dispensationalism and covenant theology. NCT claims that all Old Covenant laws have been fulfilled by Christ and are thus cancelled or abrogated in favor of the law of Christ or New Covenant law. This can be summarized as the ethical expectation found in the New Testament. Thus NCT rejects antinomianism as they do not reject religious law, only the Old Covenant law. NCT is in contrast with other views on biblical law in that most other Christian churches do not believe the 10 Commandments and other divine laws of the Old Covenant have been cancelled. New Covenant theologians see the law of Christ or New Testament law as actually including many of the divine laws. Thus, even though all Old Covenant laws have been cancelled, many have still been renewed under the law of Christ. This is a conclusion similar to older Christian theological systems on this issue, that some Old Covenant laws are still valid, but this understanding is reached in a different way. On the issue of the law, dispensationalism is most similar to NCT. But New Covenant theology may be still evolving a coherent system that will better distinguish itself from it. Richard Barcelos has criticized NCT for proposing that the 10 Commandments have been cancelled. Dual Covenant theology. Dual Covenant theology is a liberal Christian view that holds that Jews may simply keep the law of Moses because of the everlasting covenant between Abraham and God expressed in the Hebrew Bible, whereas Gentiles must convert to Christianity or alternatively accept the 7 laws of Noah. This view is in direct contrast with views generally known together as supersessionism and also the doctrines of extra ecclesiam nulla salus and solus Christus. Torah submission. Torah submissive Christians view Mosaic law as of continuing validity and applicability for Christians under the New Covenant. This view is based on the idea that Jesus, as the Son of God and Messiah, could not and did not change the standard of godly obedience, but rather affirmed both the weightier and lesser matters of Torah for those who have put their faith in him. There are both ethnically Jewish and Gentile Torah-submissive Christians. Law-related passages with disputed interpretation. The Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament describes a conflict among the first Christians as to the necessity of following all the laws of the Torah to the letter. See also Council of Jerusalem and incident at Antioch. Some have interpreted the NRSV's parenthetical statement. The parenthetical statement is not found in the NRSV's Matthean parallel Matthew chapter 15 verses 15 to 20 and is a disputed translation. For example, the Scholars Version has, "This is how everything we eat is purified." Gau's Unvarnished New Testament has, "Purging all that is eaten." See also Strong's G2511. Others note that Peter had never eaten anything that was not kosher many years after Acts chapter 2. To the heavenly vision he announced, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." Therefore, Peter was unaware that Jesus had changed the Mosaic food laws, implying that Jesus did not change these rules. Later in Acts, it should be noted that Peter realizes the vision is in reference to the Gentiles now clean through Christ. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus may have been just referring to a tradition of the Pharisees about eating with unwashed hands. The expression, "purging all meats," may have meant the digestion and elimination of food from the body rather than the declaration that all foods were kosher. The confusion primarily centers around the participle used in the original Greek for purging. Some scholars believe it agrees with the word for Jesus, which is nearly 40 words away from the participle. If this is the case, then it would mean that Jesus himself is the one doing the purifying. In New Testament Greek, however, the participle is rarely that far away from the noun it modifies, and many scholars agree that it is far more likely that the participle is modifying the digestive process, which is only 2 words away. Still others believe a partial list of the commandments was merely an abbreviation that stood for all the commandments because Jesus prefaced his statement to the rich young ruler with the statement, "If you want to enter life, obey the commandments." Some people claim that since Jesus did not qualify his pronouncement, that he meant all the commandments. The rich young ruler asked, "Which commandments?" Jesus gave him a partial list. The first set of commandments deal with a relationship to God. The second set of commandments deal with a relationship to men. No doubt Jesus considered the relationship to God important, but Jesus may have considered that the young man was perhaps lacking in this second set, which made him obligated to men. Several times Paul mentioned adhering to the law, and preached about 10 commandment topics such as idolatry. See also Law of Christ. Many Christians believe that the Sermon on the Mount is a form of commentary on the 10 Commandments. In the expounding of the law, Jesus said that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, while in Marcion's version of Luke chapter 23 verse 2 we find the extension. "We found this fellow perverting the nation and destroying the law and the prophets." See also adherence to the law and antithesis of the law.